Hello everyone, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel, I'm a writer and I've made this video to talk about my first poetry collection, Scars. I'm talking about my poetry style and why I write my poetry in this particular style, and I'm also talking about each poem by poem. I wrote Scars over a period of 3 or 4 months at the end of 2012 from about September, October when the university academic year ended. At that time it was the end of my 3rd year of uni, and at that particular time I was hearing rhyming in my head over and over again. I didn't initially write everything down straight away until the rhyming became relentless. The reason for this is because I don't view myself as a poet. As a writer, especially in my creative writing studies, which I had finished at that point in time, I viewed my specialty as prose and script writing, not poetry. I went to the effort to avoid poetry in my studies, and I haven't written much poetry in my life. Most of my poetry writing days before I wrote this collection would have been restricted to my primary school English days. That being said, I wrote this collection because I felt I couldn't ignore the rhyming I could hear in my head. When the rhyming became relentless, it was never a whole poem I would hear. It would only be a couple of lines at a time, or maybe a stanza, never a whole poem at once, and I would have no idea where those couple of lines or stanza would belong or even what it was about. And when the poems would come together, I would get more of a sense of what these particular lines or stanzas meant and where they belonged. During September, October, it was the end of the uni year, so I didn't write everything down. Anything I did write down was written on my phone as a text message and saved as a draft because I was busy finishing my final assessments, so I didn't have time to write things down every time inspiration struck. Once I handed in my final assessments and just before I went home for the summer, I had written maybe 3 or 4 poems at that point. When I went home for the summer in November and later in December, I wrote the rest of the collection as I was at home and had more time on my hands. That being said, even though I had written the collection, I hadn't had any order to it, and I finally put the poems in order around mid last year. Even though the order was established last year, I put the year that I've written the collection as 2012 because that's when it was all written. The order of the poems are important as it reflects what I went through. The first poem is about grief, about the end of life, and the last poem is about the beginning of life, so it's a full circle. I view my poetry style as literal and lyrical. Literal because the content of the poetry is autobiographical. This collection is about a specific time of my life. I wrote it at the end of the hardest chapter of my life so far. This chapter I'm referring to started on March 23rd, 2011, when a good friend of mine passed away suddenly, and then a few weeks later my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, passed away suddenly, and there was, for a lack of a better term, a family feud after his death. Then there were some people in my life who were stressing me out, who I had to cut out of my life. Then in June 2012, my maternal grandfather, my mum's dad, passed away, and there was also a family feud after his death, and he was the last of my grandparents to die. All my grandparents are gone now. I felt this chapter of my life ended at the end of 2012 when I started hearing the rhyming in my head, which I don't think is a coincidence. I'm currently in the process of writing 2 poetry collections after having an amazingly good year, so it'll be interesting to see how or if my writing style has changed and the tone of these collections once they are done. When I started hearing the rhyming in my head, I was at the end of this chapter and I was more than ready to move on. I just wanted to get over it all and move on, and I suppose this was unintentionally my way of having closure. Even though the content of this collection is autobiographical, it is about me and this hard chapter in my life. I deliberately made the effort to not mention names, dates, specific events in most of my poems, because even though I like to be autobiographical because it's more honest and raw, I also want people to read my poetry and feel that they can relate to it. It can't be all about me, even though it is. I feel that with autobiographical writing, that if I'm going to talk about myself, I should at least make it useful for other people or the people reading and listening to my poems. I feel autobiographical writing should serve a purpose. That being said, there are 4 poems that are exceptions to that rule. I also view my poetry style as lyrical because I feel that it is song-like. Even though I don't sing, and believe me, that's best for everyone, I feel that the content, the poetry itself, if I had a melody in my head and even extended the poetry or worked on it more, they probably could be half-decent songs. My poetry is not image-based or metaphorical as I've been taught in my creative writing theory classes that they should be, but the literal and lyrical poetry comes naturally to me, so that's the way I've chosen to write my poetry. The reason why this collection is called Scars is because, as I said, I was writing about a hard chapter of my life that had just ended, so this was very therapeutic. But when I was writing it, as I said earlier, I was at the point where I was like, I'm over it, I'm done, I just want to move on with my life. And even though I felt that way, which is or was a good thing, I still hadn't healed from that hard chapter, and I felt that I've healed more, but I don't think I'll ever completely heal because I'll never forget what happened. The actual word scar has a double meaning in the dictionary. Physically, it's defined as a mark left on the skin after a wound, burn or sore has healed over, and mentally it's defined as a lasting effect left on somebody's mind by personal misfortune or unpleasant experience. Scars, as the title of the poetry collection, has that double meaning because, as I said, I feel that I'll never heal from this. And in terms of a physical meaning, all of these events in this chapter of my life did take a toll on me physically. I did stress out and lost some weight and gained some weight and suffered from anxiety and panic attacks, and I had trouble sleeping. I cried a lot and threw up and got a rash from the crying because my body for some reason has a weird physical reaction to my crying if I cry hard enough and long enough, so I don't really like to cry a lot. They're not long-term physical effects. I don't really feel those effects anymore, but they're not physical effects that anyone wants to experience. I also view that the poetry in this collection explores the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. The first few poems have a lot of anger present in particular, and the last 4 poems from Bittersweet Goodbye onwards has more of a calmer tone and reaching acceptance and my need and my desire to move on from that hard chapter. And as I said, the mental effects as well as the physical effects were the stress and the lack of sleep, as well as the anxiety and being upset and just like being sad all the time and feeling betrayed and just terrible mental effects. Not a mental illness, but just I suppose the normal mental effects that you get from any kind of grief and any kind of hard time. So now I'm going to go through and talk about the collection poem by poem. Before I go through talking about each poem in the collection poem by poem, I just wanted to make a brief mention and briefly talk about the cover art that appears throughout the videos and appears on my YouTube channel. This painting of hearts, I painted it to express my feelings about a past relationship and moving on from that past relationship, and each of the hearts is like kind of a state I was in. Like the first and the last heart are hearts that like are in full health, and then the second heart, like the cracks were starting to show in the relationship, and then the broken heart was when we not only when we broke up but afterwards when we broke up. And the heart with the cross on it is a healing heart, and then it gets to the heart at the end that is fully healed again. And it's not just about that past relationship, it's also just kind of like, especially with relationships that don't work out, there's always, the heart's always in different states. So you start and end with being completely healed, and then in the middle that maybe the cracks start to show, then you're broken up, and then you're healing, and then you're healed. I wanted to make mention to that because not only because I painted it myself, but also because I thought it perfectly represented the collection and what I went through. So I hope you like it when you watch it throughout the entire video. And now I actually will go through the collection poem by poem.